Okay, guys, I think we'll start. I just started the recording, and welcome again. This is the third webinar in the series, and as yesterday, we will start from recapping what we done yesterday, what we talked about, and I will just remind you the training process. Then we'll continue with seeing the solution and discussing the solution from the practice session we presented at the end of the yesterday session. Then we'll continue theory of the entities and their data. Today we're going to talk about CRUD, about search, and stuff related to data management. Okay, so let's start from reminding the training process if somebody is here for the first time. Let me start sharing the screen. Okay, so the idea is to get you more familiar with the fundamentals of the Oro platform and Oro Commerce. So I will try to show you as many examples as possible. Some of them will be just in the UI. Most of them I will try to show you in the code. There will be question and answer session, let's call it session, after every topics, and this will be like short, only for the immediate questions. If the question requires a little bit more time to answer, we can talk about it at the last day of the webinars in the next week, or you can post this question on the Slack channel and somebody will help you. It could be community or one of us. There should be 2 breaks today. I think yesterday we had only 1 and it was not enough. So today we'll do the first break after 45 minutes and should be 10-minute break. And then another one after another 45 minutes. Slides will be shared with you and also the recording will be shared up to 24 hours after the session. And this is the Slack channel that you can get help with all the questions related to this webinar. Again, if you have any questions, please use the question and answer tabs. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can go with the chat. And I will just enable both of them. Just a second. Okay, I see them both. So let's start. So at the end of the yesterday topic, we have the practice. And this practice was related to what we learned yesterday. So yesterday we covered really crucial functionalities, which is configuration of the entities. It's a really important one because it allows you to configure many things, change the behavior of the application a lot, only by changing some configuration. As you saw, you can change this configuration through the UI, of course, but the recommended way, and this is how it should be done when you deploy the application, is to change those values in the entity annotations, if you can, or using the migration with special query that will set those values. Because, for example, if this is vendor entity, like existing core entity, you cannot modify annotation by yourself, so you'll just create the migration and set those values the way you need. The second thing is extendability of entities, and this is the main way to customize existing entities. Thanks to this, you can create new fields or new relations and add functionalities to entities that already exist and you cannot modify because you don't have control over them. And then we talked how we create migrations, and I show you how the installation and migration process work. So the practice is covering all those things. So first of all, we should create a configurable and extendable entity called user naming type. Let me open the IDE. So we created the bundle before, so we have training bundle, user naming bundle. If you would like to create the entity, we go Symfony way. We create entity directory, create user naming type class, and this is the typical entity. So we have the doctrine annotation ORM entity. As you see, we do not have custom repository for it. And we have our table annotation, which points to the table that we, of course, will have to create. To make this entity configurable, all you have to do is add the config annotation. And this is from our namespace. So you can see it here. Of course, if you have everything properly configured, you will be able to import this annotation with your ID. And we'll have some additional default values. We're going to talk about them later on. To make this entity extendable, we need to create a model. So we created the model directory, and there usually we call the model by adding the extend prefix. So if the entity is called user naming type, here we'll have extend user naming type. As you can see, it just have the constructor and nothing else. You can, well, except the annotation PHP doc. So if your entity already have the constructor, for example, because you need to initialize some doctrine collections, here you would call parent construct. Otherwise, you don't have to do this. And as it was requested in the task, we should create properties. So ID, title, and the format. So we create the property, ID, title, and the format. For them, we also use the doctrine notation. So we tag the ID, we set the generated value to auto, and the same goes with for the columns. Okay, so nothing new here. By default, if you do not have like very specific need, we do not create setter for the ID, only the getter, and then getter and setters for the other properties. Once we have this, we have the ORM annotations, we have the entity, we should create the database schema, so table for this entity. So we create the migrations directory. Inside there is a schema directory, and we create the installer. But the installer file name is not important. Usually we call it name with the name of the bundle with the installer postfix. To installer, to make it visible by the ORM, to make it work, we need to implement installation interface. And for the first point, we don't need extension our interface yet. So all we need right now to make it work is the installation. And this requires us to implement get migration version. In the first point, we should of course return 1.0, and the app function will be called. You could put everything here, but this is of course not the good idea. So we should create some functions and methods that will create the tables for us, the create relation, for example. So divide them logically. So first we start from the generation of the table, and we work on the schema. So we have schema, create table, and this is the same name we used in the entity. At the very top in the annotation here, this is the name, right? So this will bind the entity and the table for us. And then we add the columns. For ID, we should remember about the auto increment. And for the title and the format, we had some additional information here in the practice. Okay, so we added those maximum values for the string and then we set what is the primary key of the table. That's it. Right now we should execute bin console or migration load with force switch, and it will be executed. As I said yesterday, it's really strongly recommended to do the backup before we run the migrations. And if the migration is not something trivial, it's good to run them with the dry run flag to see if all the queries looks correct. Then the second step would be to add extended man-it-one relation from user entity to user naming type. And, excuse me, this should be done in the migration 1.0. So at this moment, I will create the migration, and as we recommend, we should also update the installer. So first I go to the migration, and please remember that the migration version is taken from the annotation, from the namespace. So it is important to set it correctly. I implement the migration interface, and because I will be working with the relation, I need to implement extend extension our interface. As we said yesterday, this interface requires a property, which can be called any way you like, and the setter with this exact name, set extend extension. Thanks to this installer will have injected extend extension, and we can work with the relations. Exactly the same way as we have in the installer, the public method app will be executed. And here we just create the relation. So as we said yesterday, there is few different type of relations you can create. Actually, most of them you can create with the extend extension. We were requested to create many-to-one. We can go here, and in the PHP doc, we can see the description of the arguments we need to specify. So always start from just passing the schema, then to the table, which will be, in this case, the owning side. Excuse me for a second. Okay, then we create the association name. So in this case, we would like to relate the naming type with the ORO user. So association name could be naming type, or that's the naming is up to you. Just make it, meaningful. We specify to which table we create the relation. So this is the table we just created. And what column should be used as a title. So this is not the column to create the key, to create the relation. This is column to then display this on the front. Also, it was requested to make sure that this is rendered at user view and edit pages. As we said yesterday, we have the special key called owner. And if we specify it to be owner custom, this will be automatically added to the edit page, or to the edit form actually, to the view page. And you can also, of course, configure this. And the same goes with data grids and data audits, so all the configuration. By default, it will be enabled in the view and the edit. So if I don't want to change it, I just specify the owner custom, and that's it. Now, once I create the migration, I could just execute it and it worked. The recommended way is to also update the installer. So I would just copy the method here, for example, go to the installer, add this relation to the installer, for example, in a separate method. It's exactly the same function. And then update the migration version to 1.0. So right now, if I will install the application from scratch, installer will be executed. It will set the bundle version to 1.1, and no migration will be called. Okay, and last part of the practice was to add the fixtures for these naming types. So we created the entity, and after calling the migration, we should be able to see it here, right? So we go with naming. I don't have it, probably just need to refresh it. And there it is. So unique user naming type. I have fixtures loaded already, but you can see the columns: ID, title, format, and the serialized data I mentioned yesterday. It's because the entity is extendable. So there is, with few conditions, I can create the field that will be just serialized, not an additional column. So I can copy this table here, and with the fixtures, I can, if this is something as trivial like this, I can copy it straight to the fixture. If this will be longer list, like product import, probably I would convert this to CSV file. To work with fixtures, I create the data directory inside the migrations. Then I go to the ORM. As you remember yesterday, we are able to create fixtures that are loaded always, or demo data fixtures. These fixtures we would like every time we install the application, so we put it in the ORM, not in the demo directory. Here, we extend abstract fixture, and we have the public method load. Okay. Inside, we work on the objects. We don't work like on the columns, on the schema like we did in the installer and the migrations. We work with the object, with the ORM. So I created the table that I took from the practice. Now I iterate over it. I create new usernaming type for each row. I set the title, format, persist, and at the end, I've just flashed it, and that's it. To load data fixtures, I need to call the command bin console oro migration data load, and I don't need force switch to make it work. And that would be all from this practice. So right now, you can discuss it. So if you have any questions to the solution, and if you, for example, tried it yesterday or today and have some different solution, yeah, we can discuss it. Otherwise, if there will be no question or no chat comments, we will continue with the theory for today. So please feel free to ask. Okay, there's just one question in the question answer. Marcos, I think that the installer is error prone, as it just copy and pasting. In your experience, is there any good way to avoid them? So I wasn't trying to avoid them because I kind of appreciate the way it works. Because, for example, right now, if I would create the migration, okay, so let's copy this one. Okay, I will just change the name. I will change the namespace, and here I will get the table. Of course, usually there's some method, but here I will get them. And get this table. So as you saw it, it was copy and paste, but it's not always the true, because right now I'll just add some column. So I just go table, add column, and so on. Okay. So if I will not update the installer, it's okay. It will work. Also, for something like this, I do not extend extension, so I can remove it, and the migration can be as simple as this. All this can be removed. If I want it to be extended, of course, I will just need to pass the option. Right now, I can leave it like this, and it works. Then whenever I install it from the scratch, it will install the installer. Then it will look for the migrations and execute all the migrations higher than the installer version. Okay, but then I open the installer, and I'm not sure what is the final data structure for this bundle. I need to go through all the migrations and check it myself. If this is just adding the column, it's okay. But if I would be removing some columns in one migration, adding different columns, or changing the types, it really is difficult to go. In this case, all I would have to do, I would just change it to 1.2, and I will just copy this one additional line. So I don't copy all the methods, I just copy it here, and I don't have it in separate method. I have in the same place where I should create the table, okay? And that's it. So for me, it is quite convenient. Those bundles really can get quite big. The data is large, and then there is one point where you can see all the structure for this bundle. Okay. Yeah, I don't think there are any more questions. So let's continue with today's topic. So today we continue the topic about the entities, but we're gonna focus about the presentation, about searching entities, so everything that is related with the data. This is the same slides, so you got them yesterday, and we've ended up here on the migrations, and you should just follow up. So the data grid. If you've already seen Oro, you've seen that data grids are presented nearly everywhere. So this is the way to present the data, and we use them both in the backend and in the front end of the application. Data grid is just a representation of some data from some data source. So as we said yesterday, or actually at the first day, there are few sources already defined, and can be ORM, it can be search, it can be array, and you can create additional data sources by implementing the interface. So there is a data source interface. And you just implement it and can then use it as an interface. So for example, we have this array data source, and this defines how this can be used as a source for the data grid. And you can see it's stacked with data grid data source array. So then whenever I create data grid, actually we're going to talk about this in a moment, I can specify and here I will specify, for example, API or array or ORM, okay? So depending on the configuration, if we go with ORM, and in most cases you will use ORM data source, it will create the query and then display the result, display filters, sorting, and the pagination. As you will see in a moment, it also supports inline editing, and you can add additional actions. So first, let's see it work. Okay, I should have it here. So, for example, contact. Data grid changed quite a lot from 2.6, or actually from 3.1 to 4.1. So if you work with the previous, you can see that the view is different, but also some of the functionalities are different. So this is the data grid. I have the columns, I have the rows. I can select them. Here I can choose if I select all or just all the visible. So all is for all the pages, all visible is just from this page. And then here I toggle the filters. This is not obvious. I can refresh or I can reset. And here I have the settings. So first of all, I have the columns. And yesterday we talked when this column is displayed here. So whenever we have the migration, when we create those or add those new fields, we pass the ORO field options. And then there also a data grid is visible. And there are a few flags. Actually, let me find them for you. There we go, data grid scope. So whenever you create a migration, you can pass numbers or you can use those constants, and you have the explanation here. So visible false, it will be not visible, and also it will not be displayed here. So we'll not be able to make it visible. Then we have the visible true. You have it visible and you can manage it. Invisible mandatory, it will be displayed and you cannot hide it. And is visible hidden, it will be not displayed, but you can make it visible. Okay, so those four can be used. And let's find some installer. For example, this one. So this is how we pass it. In this case, it was a relation. And here we have the data grid. It's visible, and we pass the value. So here I have the columns. I can also reorder them. Okay. And I have the filters. The same goes with the filters. I can decide about the filter should be created and displayed when I create this field, or I can also change it in the data with YAM. And the filters are a little bit more complex because filter can be with different types. There is also a very nice functionality called the views. So for example, I work with all the contacts, but my colleagues only works with the contacts from the specific country, or for the, let's go with the specific state. So he would enable the filter for the state. and he would set the value, for example, to Virginia. Okay, so it took me a few clicks, right? If I would have to do this every day at the beginning of the work or a few times a day, it's not a very nice experience. So here I can save it. And now I created the view. I can also create them from the code perspective. And I can switch the views. Okay, so you see it's visible right now. And if I work always with the Virginia contacts, actually I can open it and make it default. So this means that if I go somewhere else and then go back to contacts, I will start with the contacts I want to see because I work with them. And it's really used a lot by the marketing, especially for the leads or the opportunities. If you have departments, so somebody is responsible for different part of the data, and this is how you can start working with it. And also, when you have it, you can share it with others. So by default, this view is for you, but you can share it with other users. Now, how this grid looks from the code perspective. Okay, so first we're gonna talk about the ORM data source. So we can create the query using the select from where group by just a DQL. So let's open Datagrid, for example, for the contacts we've seen. If I would look for some Datagrid, I would go with the text search. Oh, actually, let's go back to the UI for the second. I need to modify this grid, and actually, there will be a practice to do this. How do I find the grid name? The simplest way is to inspect it, and here you go to the main div, and there is a data page component name, and this is the name of your grid. It's contacts grid. So I just copy this value, I go back here, I search for it, and I know the definition of the grid will also have the semicolon. So as you can see, just adding those semicolon narrow down the results a lot. And for sure, I'm looking for something from the contact bundle. So this is it. So this is definition. It can really sometimes get long. And you have great support here if you have the plugin installed. So really, please do it. First of all, I can specify extent entity name. So which extent entity I should be using. If I don't do this, I will not have those fields added dynamically that I specified in the migration, because I will not be using the extended entity. So I will only have the fields visible that I configure here. Then I have the ACL resource. We're gonna talk about it on Tuesday, I think, or yeah, I think it's on Tuesday. And also I can use some mixing. So actually the pre-made piece of configurations. Most important right now for us is source. So I specify the type of the source, and then I start creating the query. I have the select. I can select the specific properties, or even I can select the whole entity, but please be careful because it takes performance hit with the hydration. And then I specify the from. Of course, I can use joins and everything I need here, but as you can see, if I want to join, I specify the table, I add some alias, and then I have joins. So for joins, I use the property names and the relation names. So I join addresses. If I need to join with some condition, of course, I can specify it here. So for example, contact can have many addresses, but only one address can be specified as primary. So if I only want to have this one, I just specify there's a condition primary true. Okay, so this is how you start creating the data grid. Also, there is an important hint. Let's make a typo here. And let's go back to contacts. Okay, so this is kind of misleading. I have the information, no results found, but actually the truth is there's an error in my configuration. So whenever I have this and I start working with Datagrid and I have issues seeing the data, let me just open my console. I would start tailing logs, just like we did yesterday. Sorry, a second. Yeah, I got it. I will start tailing logs, and now I would refresh it again. And here I will have the information what's wrong. Getting grid data failed, and actually I have the information. There is no field name or association called first name. Yeah, that's true. So I can just correct it to the correct name and it will work again. So if you're pretty sure that you have data, please just take for the logs and check. Usually there is an error with your configuration. So once we configure the query, then we should start configuring what we should present, right? Because we have the value selected. We can maybe, for example, need it for some listener later on, but we should also define what we want to present. So let's collapse this. And by the way, if you would like to enable inline editing, it's just this. Inline editing enable true, and then you can override this value for specific columns. Okay, now I have the columns section. And here I just specify which columns I would like to display. I can also have a column that is not being displayed only because I would need to use this ID somewhere else. If there is no changing of type or anything, all I need to define the column is the name. And this is the name of the data I selected. So in the select, I need to have the first name and the label that should be used for it. And here, as I remember, it already works with suggestions too. So feel free to go. Okay, so I define the columns and also I can define the priority for them. And then they are being, displayed in the front. Once I specify the columns, some of them can be quite complex. For example, if I need to have a special functionality for changing for email like here, for example, check if this is unique or some other stuff, I can edit the inline editing section and modify it by myself. Usually you don't have to do this. Also, there is I don't think that this, yeah, there is a possibility. Let me find it. Yeah, there's a possibility to create a column that have some specific presentation or something special inside. So we just specify that the front-end type of this column is HTML, and we create a template. In this case, it will not just display the value, it will display the template in each cell of this column. So for example, here I can try, as you can see, I can truncate the value, or I can apply some filters. Really, I can do a lot of customization just by changing the display to be template. I can create any custom template. I can use Quick extension, and then for each cell of this data grid, this template will be rendered. Okay, so this is mostly about the columns. Then I need to configure the filters usually. So for the filters, it's similar. I have the filters namespace. I have the columns. And then for each column I want to have filter, I add the section. This is the name of the column usually. I define the type. This is the type of the filter, not type of the data. And then the data name, so which value from my select I would like to filter using this filter. Okay, so for example, for the first name, as you can see, I have the plain text filter. If this will be like relation, I could use, for example, entity filter and display all the possible choices. Also, I could just override the value of choices. And here, as you can see, and this is also a nice hint, you can use services in Datagrids. You can use them here in the filter. So for example, here I'm calling the provider that will just give me the choices. So I can find the service. Of course, not in Datagrids YAML. And there is a method get choices, and actually call this method from inside the Datagrid filter. I can also use the services in the Datagrid's source. For example, in the where, I can check if the date, the quarter is, if the date is between the first and the second quarter, and call some service that will check the current date and return the Boolean value. Okay, once we have the filters, the last, usually we add the sorters. So which columns should be sortable? Very similar notation. So we have the sorters, columns, and for each column, we specify its name and which data it should use for sorting. So if there is a sorter applied to this given column, actually, let's go to the all context back again, set it as default, and I can change the ordering by this column. Also, I can specify which should be the default one at the very end. So by default, I have sorting enabled by last name and the first name columns. Okay, so this is just the presentation. Once I have it, as we mentioned a second ago, we can have actions. So there are two types of actions for Datagrids. First one is the raw action. So I have them here. I can view, I can edit, I can delete. Also, there is one specific action that is applied to the click on the row. So as you can see, if I go through the cells, I can click the pencil to edit this specific value. Or if I just click somewhere else on the row, I go and execute some action. By default, it will be, of course, view action. But if your entity doesn't have view, only have edit, I can configure the data grid to use the edit instead. Okay, so how does it work? I specify the properties. In most cases, you will have just the ID. If the tilde is here, it means that this property doesn't have any specific configuration, so it will directly be mapped to the ID from the select. So this ID will be equal ID from the select. Okay, and oh, sorry, I will just collapse because there is too much scrolling right now. I don't need columns and I don't need source at this moment. So I have the ID, and here I have the actions. I have the view, update, and delete action. As you can see, I can specify what is the type. Here it's a navigate because I want to go there. For delete, it's different. But the delete action, usually you don't have to create. We're going to talk about this later on today. I specify which ACL resource I should check to display this action or not. So if I do not have this permission, I will not see this action. Label and icon, of course, this is pretty obvious. And also I have the link, and the link is the parameter. So here, a little bit above in the properties, I have the view link. Its type is URL, which route should it use, and which parameter should be used for this route. So I see ID, I have the property ID, and that's it. If I remove this property, I will have issue with this action. Oh, actually, yeah, it didn't refresh it. So it worked. Okay. The same goes with the update. The only thing is I'm using the update link and I'm using different route. Okay, so I can create more. As I remember, if there is only two actions, they will be displayed inline. Otherwise, this will be this very small pop-up for your actions. So also, here is how you define the default row action. So as you see, I have it for review. If I will move it to the update, and reset the grid, okay, I'm modifying the wrong grid. I went straight, and why it didn't work yet? Okay, let me check for a second. Oh yeah, now it works. Sorry, it wasn't refreshed enough. So as you can see, now the row action is updated. We have few data grids that actually we change the action from view to update by default. It depends, of course, of your specific needs. Okay, so this is the first type of the action. The second type is called mass actions. So we have them here below. For contacts, we have the special action called merge. By default, there will be, for example, delete. I can click few of the rows, and here on the right, I have mass actions. So I can delete, and for the contacts, I have merge. Merging is pretty nice functionality. I can enable merging for other entities. By default, it's enabled for the contact, and this is again thanks to the entity configuration. So if I find the contact entity, there is a merge enabled in the configuration. And this is how it looks. I have the contacts in the columns, and I decide which value should be taken in the entity that will be created after merging those two. Okay. Now, how can we customize those data grids? The simple one and the one that you use for pretty most of the cases, it just merges the configuration. It's be careful because you need to remember about the order. It will be merged in the bundle priority order. And also, if you overwrite something in one bundle, you can overwrite it then in the second bundle, and it can be a little bit messy. So you shouldn't overwrite one data grid in few bundles to avoid such problems. So if I would like, for example, edit this contact grid with some small modification, I will create this inside my bundle. So let's find the grid again. I will just need this name. Then I will go to my bundle, open Datagrid YAML, specify the contact grid, and whatever I do here, it will be merged with the original configuration before creating the data grid. The second way is extending grids. So let's check it. Let's search in Datagrid YAML, and let's find extends. Okay, so as you can see, I can extend some other data grids. For example, here I extend the cases grid. So this configuration is taken, and then I can apply, for example, additional conditions or disable the pagination. And I have the new data grid with new name. So I can use the cases grid in one place and user cases grid, for example, in the profile. And then if both of those are not sufficient for your solution, for your logic, I can use grid events that you actually seen yesterday, and there is no limit then. Okay, please also remember that you can use templates for specific cells, so this is also a very good extendability point, but in the end, you can always use the events, and in this event, you can inject some other services, check some conditions, check some system configuration, add some additional queries, do anything you want, and you just need to think when you want to modify. So is it modification of the configuration of data grid, or is this modification of the results already? So here, for example, I can add some filters. Why not? Let's open this listener. Excuse me, it was in catalog bundle. Let's check how it's tagged. So here I can see it will be using pre-build for the products grid and build before for the product select grids. Okay, for those grids and all those events, we will execute some methods. And if I would like to add some filter, I can check some conditions, for example, and then I'm using the paths that were also used in the configuration and adding some additional columns or filter, or just changing the filter type, for example. Or I can remove the filter. This is also the con of using Datagrid CM merging. I can add some values, I can override some values, but I cannot remove, right? Whenever I merge, I'm not able to remove something. And for the simple cases, I can set render false, but I still cannot just remove it. And the last but not least, I can create the grid extensions. This is a little bit more complex functionality. We're not going to cover this right now, but for example, pagination works this way. And also there is one nice feature I would like to show you. If I filter the data grid right now, for example, let's filter this by Georgia state. Oh, it's already here. Oh yeah, I changed the, yeah, this is the issue. Okay, I have few records, actually 6 of them. I can go inside. And I need to work with all those records, for example, contact them or change some value. It's not very good experience to click go back. Fortunately, filter state is persistent, so it is still filtered for me. But also there is functionality that we can use. Here on the right corner, I can just iterate over the results I have. So as you remember, there were 6 records, and I can just go from one to another without going back to index. So this is pretty useful if you need to work with the specific data set of this given grid. Okay, so now let's just very quick practice. I will do it, but you can think 1 minute about the solution. I would like to disable the first name filter from the context grids the simplest way you can. I'll give you a solution in 1 minute, so just think which way you would start. Okay, and I will do it with you right now. So first of all, I would start from getting the grid name. Simple way is to inspect again and get the name of the grid here, context grid. So I know that I will need to use this name in my customization. I will add it here. Then I will find the filter name, for example, in the original contact grid. I will go to the filters. This is the first name filter. Okay, so I will go to my data grid. I will go with the filters, use the suggestions. I will go with columns. Now I need to use the name that I copied. And again, if you have everything configured properly, control space, and I can see what I can use here. And this sounds promising, right? I can set enabled, control space. Yeah, let's make it enabled false. I go back to the grid. As you can see, the filter is here. I reset the filter, sorry, reset the data grid, refresh it. And it's gone. Okay, that's it. I just customize the data grid from my bundle that is in my source directory, so I have full control over this. Of course, it's simple customization, but I can also change the column type, I can change the purity, and reorder the columns in this case. In many cases, you will be asked by the client to just reorder because he wants to have the same order that you have, for example, in some external system. So this is way to go. You just create the grid with the same name and just modify the columns or the filters. Okay, we're gonna talk about CRUD in a moment. Right now, let's do this short question and answers. We're gonna do 10 minutes break and we're gonna talk about CRUD. So let me check if there are any questions. Oh, actually, there is only two. Marcus, I was forbidden by the client to store data for some entity they had, and I was requested to create a data grid with no entity database component. Is there any way to achieve it without hacking the data grid or creating my own? Okay, but Marcos, what was the source of this data in this case? Was it like API or how did you get this data? Yeah, in this case, I haven't tried this, but it should work. You would have to create API data source, implement the data source interface, and then call the specific client for this API and to get the records. This is how it would work. Of course, it will be not that trivial because we would also implement the way to filter the data, but yeah, it is possible. Christian, can you filter on joint data? How many levels to join? Yeah, this is just the query you are building. So you can filter for the data you joined. Just remember, if you join the data, you should not fetch everything from this join, only the columns you need. And then there is no limit. You can filter on every data you added to the query. Adrian, how add a custom action by row? Okay, so you want to have different action for each row, or what do you mean, Adrian? Because if you want to change the row action, you just create new action in the data grid configuration and mark it as row action true. So let me find the actions. As you see here, this is row action true. If you need to make this action different for example, some values in this row, it is possible, but it will not be covered at this moment. You can please post your question in the Slack channel. Okay, guys, let's do the 10-minute break and 5 past. We're gonna start again. Okay, guys, we can continue. So we're gonna talk about the CRUDs right now. As you saw yesterday, if we create this custom entity, you have create a CRUD created for you out of the box. But in most of the cases, you will work with your entities, and then you will need to generate it by yourself. But this is not something difficult. So first of all, we always have the entity index page. So this is the root without any parameters. And usually, and in most cases, it will contain the data grid and all actions for related with all the entities. And it uses the index template. Okay, so this is what we actually seen a moment ago. This is the index page. You see that I have quite long URL here, but this is the data grid state. By default, the address looks like this. One thing I forgot to mention about data grid. Once I filter it, I can also export, and I will only export the data I see. So this is also good functionality to export not the all data that we're gonna talk about import-export bundle next week, but to only export the part of the data that I'm interested in. And from the controller perspective, let's find the contact controller. There is an index section. And it's very simple. I just return the entity class that I'm serving in this index. I define the road, so I have the name. I do not have any parameters, as you can see. I specify the template. If I using the default one, I don't need to use the path here. And I can always go and check it. ACR assessor is the protection of this route, and also we're gonna cover this next week. So let's see the template. First of all, for the index, for the view, for the update, in most cases, you would like to extend the existing templates for those sections. So as you can see, I extend Oro UI bundle actions index HTML tweak. And here I have the blocks and everything defined for this template. And I just override some values. So first of all, I set the grid name that I want to display here. For index pages, I set the page title because usually it will not have any variables. It will just display the plural label for the given entity. So I just need the trans. This is the filter to translate the translation string. And then I can, for example, extend the navigation buttons. And in this case, add the buttons to import, export this specific entity. And also, if I have the permission, I will display the button to add or to create this entity. So, as you can see, I have import, export buttons and the create contact because I have the permissions. And now about the CRUD. So create, read, update, delete. And let's start from the read. So if we want to display the view page, you need to read the entity, right? So you get the specific entity from the repository and use the find method actually for this, but you don't do this by yourself. In most cases, it will be done by the param converter. And the read entities are stored in the unit of work. This is example actually just how you can fetch the entity. For example, you get the repository for the business unit and find one by some specific property. In this case, find one by name. And the controller, we have the route with the ID, because if you want to display the view, you always need to pass the ID. And for example, in Datagrid, when we were displaying the view link, as you remember, we passed the ID of the entity. And let's see it in the controller. So let's go to this contact controller again. So we have the view action. As you can see, we pass the entity, not just the class name. We pass the entity to the template, but also we have the ID here. And because we have the type hinting, we have the hint that this is contact, the param converter for the Symfony is smart enough to get the repository for this entity, find the entity with the specific ID, and return it to us, okay? So I don't need to, get it myself, fetch it myself. I don't need to inject repository here. I have the hint that this is the contact entity. I have the ID, and it will do this for me. Okay, so that's it. The view template is a little bit more complex than the index template, but the idea is the same. We start from extending the view, the basic view template from the UI bundle. We also, I didn't mention this, we import some macros. So as you can see, whenever I want to display some property, for example, here, I'm not just using the variable name, that's it. We have some macros to display those properties. First of all, those macros will generate additional markup to make it look nicer a little bit. So let's go to the view page. And this is formatted this way, for example. But also, for example, it can check the permissions for me. And if you want to play with it, you can check by copying it, going to the macros from the UI. So this one, and sorry, not this one. view. Yeah, this one. And here you can check what the specific macro does. Okay, so it takes the title, some data, entity, field name, and it can check if you have, for example, permission to view this page, to view this specific property. So this is why you don't want to just display it as it is and want to use those macros. Let's go back and continue with the view template. So I have the navigation buttons, and when you have the index, you want to have the buttons that are related to the entity list, right? So import, export, create new entity. If you're on the view page, you want to have the buttons related to this specific entity. So again, I'm adding buttons to edit and to delete if I have the permissions. And also there is a title set. As you can see, I only specify some param. We're gonna cover the menu generations later on today, and you will see where the title is taken from. Then I have the page header and the stats. The stats we already talked yesterday. This is the stats. This is the header. In header, we use the name provider to display the text representation of given entity. For every entity, we can have different name provider and specify the way it should be displayed. So we do not use toString methods for this in the entity. And then we have the content. The content can be divided into the sections, as you can see here. And then if we have those sections, we can modify them, as you saw yesterday, using scroll data event, and add some additional blocks or even whole templates, whole sections, without overwriting the template, which is always a good, because you will get the updates once you need to update the platform. It will not. Actually, I will give you a small hint. Let's check right now. If you will see this error, it means that you do not have the ID for this specific template. Okay, so you just need for view and for the edit, you need to specify this ID because it will be used to dispatch this scroll data event that you can catch and you can modify using this event. Let's continue. Now we have create, and create is very similar to update in the action, and also usually they reshare the template. So if I want to create, I create some entity object, I persist it, flash the manager, and the entity is stored in the unit of work and into the database. So it is very similar to what we did when we loaded the fixtures, right? So it creates new entity, sets some values, persists it, and then flash the manager. Okay, so this is very, of course, it's a little bit more complex in the controller, but the idea is the same. To call the create root, we don't need parameters again because we're gonna create the entity, so we do not have the ID yet. Then we have some form. We fill in the form, we submit, the controller validates the form, and display the result. If the form is valid, you can be redirected to the view or to the index, for example. Let's go to the controller again. And there is a create action. As you can see, it has some logic, and at the end, it calls the update private method here. From the UI, excuse me. From the UI, you will go to the index. You create, and the display, you have the form. The template for this, you can check also from the controller. As you can see, I do not have the create template. I use the update template. So the idea is actually pretty the same, because for the update and for the create, I display the same template. But for the update, I have some data filled already with from existing entity. And for the create, I need to fill in the data myself. And also here is the logic. If the ID is already set, the action for the form is update, otherwise the action is the create. Okay, so this is where we differentiate each other. And exactly the same, we have some nav buttons, and they will be displayed only on the edit page. We have the header, and we have the content. Depending on the entity, sometimes we'll list the form components like this. Sometimes we will just display whole form. You will need to remember that also there will be these dynamic fields that will be displayed at the end in the additional section. And those are the fields that were added by the extended functionality and configured to be displayed in the form. How this data is validated, we're gonna cover in a moment. And also there was a quite good discussion on the Slack channel yesterday. If you want to check if you would add new field and you configure it to be displayed on the form, but then you would like to add it to in the form extension manually because you want to change, for example, the component type or something, you either have to write the migration to disable it in the field config, or you need to add the option in your form extension is dynamic field and set it to true, so there will be no conflict. Now the update. The difference from the create is that we first get the entity, we change it, and then we flash it. In the controller, you will see that the update action calls the update directly. So we do not have this creating logic. First, we just go to the update. Here of course, it will be different for each controller. We have the update handler, which fetches the form, validates it, and display the result. As you saw in the view, just a second, there were a few buttons here. Save and close, save and new, save and stay. And this is because this button on the update or create, let us define what I want to do after I create the entity. So if I have a list of contacts I want to create, I can go to save and new, or I can go to save and just see the view page, or save and close will get me to the index of this given entity. And at the end of the CRUD, of course, there is a delete. So it gets the entity, called the remove from the entity manager, then we flash the entity manager, and the entities are deleted and removed from the unit of work. In most of the cases, you will not have to add this action to the data grid, and it will be there automatically. And this is thanks to the operations. We have functionality called operations. We're gonna cover this a little bit more during the workflows at the very end of the day, but now I will just show you an example how it works, okay? I will first open the delete from the ID. Delete, and it should be in actions. And it should be in UI bundle. Okay, UI bundle, sorry, action bundle. Then I go to the resources, config, RO actions, and here I have then delete. So first of all, it's extend CRUD action, which is also here in this file at the top, and it specifies the conditions when this action should be applied. So I need to have some data, I need to have the grid name, and some route. And then our delete action have additional conditions, and it's set that it should be applied to all entities and to all data grids. It should be added to specific places like nav buttons and the data grid row action. This is the one we are looking for. And here there are preconditions to have this action added to your data grid automatically. I must have route set for the config, and I must have the grid name. So let's check the contact, or actually, let's check the user naming entity. Here, as you can see, I have the root name set. So I have the information on which root this should be applied. And I have the default grid name set. And that's all I need to do to display this bin icon and to be able to remove the entities. And let me open the index page. This is something you're gonna create today in the practice if you would like to do this. As you can see, I have the delete icon here. And if I go to my Datagrid configuration, you can see that I have action here only for the view. I do not have the delete action. So if there is nothing specific in my delete action, so I don't need to do any additional functions and additional calls whenever I delete this entity, I don't need to create an action for this. I don't need to create a handler for this. I just add those config values to the entity. I update the entity config, and that's it. So this is really good to remember. It will save you a little bit of time. Here, if you would like to read a little bit more about the operations, it's really nice way to add functionalities or processes to entity, to a data grid. It works also on front end. Really recommend to check this a little bit. And sometimes you can display that in the data grid row, or it can be, for example, print PDF button on the order view page. Now we're gonna talk about menu. So we use the KNP menu bundle, and on top of this we have navigation bundle from Oro. Menu is represented by the tree structure, and inside of this navigation YAM we can define labels, routes, and the position. And I will open this user bundle navigation YAM in IDE. So I have the items, and I have the tree, and then I have the titles, okay? So in the items, I configure the tabs and also the items itself. If I want to configure the tab, as you can see here, for example, I do not have the URI and only have some additional attributes. I have the position and I have the extras. If I configure specific item, for example, let's find the user view page. Here I will have the route specified for it, okay? And also let's see the one from the contact controller, sorry, from the contact bundle. There is one nice functionality I would like to show you. Yeah, for example, this one, or even the one here. So I have the contact list, and this is Oro contact index. So this is exactly this action, right, that we clicked so many times already. And this is Oro contact index. So I define the label, I define the route, I define the position, and I have some extras. So why these extras are important? Here I can have specific routes, or I have some regex. So whenever I go to the create contact, I do not have create contact item in my menu. So the contacts menu should be highlighted, right? But I am not in the Oro index, Oro contact index route anymore. So this is why you can configure those extra routes. So it means that whenever you click this item, you will go to this one. But whenever any of those configured here, as I said, you can configure them directly or with the regex, it will highlight the item. So you don't have this item like to create or update a contact in your menu. So it will just highlight the item for the index. Okay, let's go back to the slide. And how can you customize it? First of all, you can go to the UI. Let's talk about menus you can see here. So this is a main menu. Here we have the shortcuts. So for example, I can look for something like accounts, okay, and I can use shortcut to create an account. Then we have the pins. I can remove them, and I need to work with something, but need to check something else first. So I go to the customers, and I can pin this. So it will appear here. And I can the same way pin specific entity, not just the index page. So I can go to specific customer, pin it, and it will be added here. So then I can navigate very quickly between pages I saw. Another menu is here. We are talking about backend menus right now only. We're gonna cover the front store application in the next webinar. So this is user menu. And also here, I have the favorites menu. Favorites works similar to pin. So if I click favorite, I will have access here in the favorites. Okay. Also, there is a history and the most views. So there is pretty few ways to navigate on Oro. So if I would like to modify the menu and I want to do it from the UI, I will go to System, Menus. I have the menus. So Application, once again, Shortcuts, User menu, and the Calendars menu are on the calendar in the dashboard. So let's go to the Application menu. This is it. I actually modified dashboards a second ago. So let's open the customers. I can open the accounts. Because those are system links, so they are created in the navigation YAM, I cannot update it, and I cannot update the URL, and I cannot delete it, but I can hide it if I want to. So I can make account to my accounts, just to make it something simple, save it. He will ask me to reload the page. And now in customers, I will have my accounts. Okay, so this is very simple customization. I can also hide it. And now reload the page. And it should be hidden, and it is. Okay, there is also something called divider, but it's not respected in all the places in the UI. So for example, as I remember, here you have divider between my calendar and logout, but it's also one added here on the dashboard, and it's not displayed actually in this current theme. So just so you know. So this is how I can edit the menu from this place, and also I can add some new menu items. Let's open this one. Oh, okay, I will check this in a moment. Company A. I can pick some icon. And it should be added. Excuse me, where did I add it? Customers, reload the page. And it's here, okay? So I can modify them from the UI. I can create new items. I can edit the existing one. If this is custom item, I also should be able to delete it, which I cannot do for the items that are configured in the system, in the code. Then, of course, I can modify them using navigation YAM. And this works similar to Datagrid YAM, which means I can merge those YAMs, and you're gonna see this in a moment. And I can also create the listener for configure menu event. And this is if I want to change specific menu or specific menu item and on some conditions that I do not have access to the UI. So I can create the menu extension. For example, applying ACLs is an extension. So as you saw in the navigation YAM, I do not have ACLs defined here. It works the way that it goes to the route, and it applies this ACL. So if I do not have the ACL required by this specific controller action, I will not see this navigation item. And this is thanks to the menu extension that applies the ACLs. And also I can create custom menu builders. If I want to have something very customized, I can just create new menu builder, tag it with Oro menu.builder, and go on. One more thing, there are also page titles. So I have the items. This is first thing. Covered this. Then I have the tree. The tree, I specify where I want to display those items. So I specify the menu. As you can see here, I'm adding the item to the application menu and to the shortcuts menu. Then I go down to the tree. So I have the children, I have the customer tabs, children, and I just add the item. And the same for the shortcuts. But in the shortcuts, there is no tabs, right? As you saw, the shortcuts, this is the list. I just can filter them. And also, I didn't show you, I can modify them here in the shortcuts. And I can add new links. I can change the name of the existing one and everything, exactly like the application menu. And the last section here are the titles. And as we said already, for the index, we usually do not specify them because usually it will be just the plural name of the entity. So if you go to the contacts, as you can see, it will be just contacts, all contacts. And for the other titles, I can specify them to, for example, use some variable like contact name or variable and some additional label. So it means that whenever I go to this update template, there is a title set, as we are using the title from the navigation YAM, and for this variable, we should use contact full name. Okay, so this is how we build page titles. So very short exercise, and again, just think how you go with it, and I will show you the solution live in a moment. The idea is to add navigation YAM and add a new item, my custom contacts. It should be displayed just before the contacts, and it should use our contacts in the route. Okay, let's go with the solution. So let me make it smaller. So first of all, I will check the contacts. So I already know this is the contacts bundle navigation YAM. So I will go to IDE. I can close everything for a moment. Go to the contact bundle, resources, config oro, navigation YAM, and this is the contact list, right? So this is going to the index, and this is where I want to add something. As you can see, and this will be true in most places, if we have something ordered already in oro, we will not use next numbers, so not 10, 11. We will add some gaps so we can inject something between them. So I would copy this to make it faster. I would create the navigation YAM here. Excuse me, actually I had menu configs already. So I would add some item, my contact list. It should use, of course, translation string, but I can also hard code it. It should use the same route. The position, remember, should be just smaller. And then I would check where was it in the tree. So it's contact list, it's here. So I just copy this. And here I have already tree, I have the application menu. So I would add it here. Excuse me. So customers tab, children, my contact list. Okay, let's check it. Okay, so it's at the bottom. So why it didn't work with the position? Maybe it was like this. Yeah. Okay, that's weird. Okay, I will check the position in a moment, and I will let you know in the Slack what I did wrong. So we don't have to stop right now. But this is how you can modify the navigation. You can see it's merged exactly the way as we merged for the data grids. So I can also hide some elements this way, or mostly reorder or add additional elements just by adding them to the navigation YAML. Now, the validation. We already said that whenever we create an entity or we update entity, we validate it. And for validation, we use the Symfony way. So we use the validation YAML. In this validation YAML, we specify what constraints should be applied to whole entity and what should be applied to the field. The difference is that we have field constraint that will just check if this field is correct. For example, if the length is correct, if this is number, so it doesn't contain any non-numerical characters. And in the entity, we can check if the fields are okay with each other. For example, check correlation between fields. If the field A have some specific value, we can check if the field B have the value that is correct. Okay, so we can make correlation between the fields. So it can be assigned to the field or the whole entity or both. You can pretty easily add custom constraints. We're not gonna cover this, but you can go to the Symfony documentation and you will see this is not difficult. And it's automatically called on the form submission. So whenever you just submit the form, you don't need to call it. But if you have some process, some functionality where you need to check if this is a correct entity, for example, you create some custom import-export, and you create the entity with some values from the CSV file and you want to check if this is valid, you can get the validator service and just validate passing the object. It will check what is the class of this object and will validate properties and the class against validation of this specific class. So validation YAML doesn't go to config oro, it goes to resources config, and this is like Symfony way. Also, this is pretty good cache, so I recommend that once you modify it, you just remove the cache and then check if it works. So validation YAML can look like this. First of all, I have the class name. Then I have the constraints, and those are the constraints for whole class. For example, for the contact to be valid, I need some contact information, which can be email, can be phone or address, okay? So this can be many fields. And so I could not have this validated on the field level. I need to validate this on the class level. So I have the constraint. Let's actually open this validation YAML for the contact bundle. And let's check this has contact information validator. And this is constraint, this is validator. Okay, so here I can check, for example, if it has first, last name, email, or phones, and if none of those, I can return the violation. So it can be very simple. As you can see, it's pretty simple logic. So we have the constraint, and we apply the, we point to which validator it should use. And then we have the properties. And in the properties, we can list any property of this class and apply some constraints. So for example, we see that the first name cannot be longer than 100 charts. We can check the dates, we can check if the choice is correct. We can, this is very important one. So for example, addresses is the relation, and if we do not have the valid, it will not check if the address object is valid, okay? So it will just check the thing I need to check for my relation, for example, if there is a primary. But if there would be any validation on the address object, for example, the street cannot be empty, it will not be checked if I do not have this valid specified here for the relation. So this is important to remember. Excuse me, just refreshed. Okay. So that's it about the validation. As you can see, there is nothing like very ORO specific, and you just create the validation YAM and then you define the rules. It's good to remember that you can validate it by yourself because it's only validated automatically for the forms. And then we have the search. So search index are used in every application right now because it's way more efficient than searching the database using like full text searches or some other ways. In the Enterprise Edition, we are using the Elasticsearch. In the Community Edition, we have this search implemented in database using entity attribute value approach. Okay, so it's create an item for entity and then separate rows in separate tables for entity attributes, entity properties. So then I can specify the field and relation that I want to use for the search. Of course, you can modify the search. There is an event called ORO search prepare entity map, and there you can modify what is being indexed for this specific entity. And also you can build custom queries for those search. For example, we have ACL helper for the search and apply if the organization is set, for example. So I cannot search outside my organization. And how do we define it? I create ORO search YAM. So again, as you can see, we really configure a lot in those YAMs. So for the contact bundle, it could look like this. I have the search namespace. Then I have the fully qualified class name. I have some alias for it, and we're gonna talk about alias in a second. I have the label. I have the title fields. This is not used in the newest version. In newest version, name provider will be used for this. I defined the route that I should use for the creating a link of this item when I have it in the search results. And I defined the template used to display it. So actually, let's see it in the application. And the search is here. I can search in all system, or I can search for the specific entity, like in the contact and for Debra. And then thanks to this, I'm in the contacts right now in the search result, and I have Debra displayed here. So the template used for rendering this item is specified in the search YAM. So this is the template here. The route I have here is the route that I will be redirected to when I click this title. And here is the mapping of the fields I want to add to the search. So this is the name of the property. This is in what field type it should be added, and what should be name of the field in the index. So this is nice because if I have few fields like first name, middle name, and last name, I can add them to the same target field. And in index, I will have, for example, full name field, and I can search by the full name. Okay, so I do not have the full name in my entity, but I can have it in the index. Also, all the fields that are of type text will be added to the special field called all text. So whenever I search, I will also search in this all text field. And here I can map the fields, but also I can map the relations. So for example, for the phones, and I can map how the relation should be indexed. Okay, so this is, you can see, pretty easy to configure. Also, it will be covered in the practice if you would like to play with this and see how it works. It's very important that you remember this search reindexation. Search indexation is done asynchronously. So if I have some changes and I do not have the consumers running, the changes will not be reflected in the index. Oh, let's also see this template. So this one. So there's a comment you don't have to copy it, but this is just for you to remind that you have access to two and variables here. First one is the entity, and this is whole entity connected to the item you found, and the second one is the indexer item. So this is have the access to the values that you have in the index. Okay. So by default, you will extend the default search result item template, and you will just specify a few additional values, like what should be used for the title, if I should show the image or not, and then what entity information should be displayed. So for the contact, I see that I displayed the created at and updated at, and this is it. Okay, so this one is actually pretty straightforward, and when I just click it, I go to it. So this is the backend search. You also need to remember that the backend search and the frontend search have different indexes. So the backend one is oral search. And as you saw on the first day, this is the structure in database. So I have the item, and for this item, I have the text, integer, decimal, and the datetime properties stored in separate tables. So I will look with the full text, for example, only in the index text. Here in the item, we have the entity, we have the alias, and we have the ID. So with the class name and the ID, of course, I can find the correct entity using the entity manager. And also there is something like the advanced search. So you just saw the UI quick search, and also I can search using the API. So let's go with this one. To access the API, I need to go to the admin API doc. So this is like the sandbox we created. Of course, you can also use the Postman, which I recommend if you want to test API calls with different values and stuff. But for the simple calls, this API doc is good enough. Here there are two types of the, first of all, I can authenticate myself. And for authentication, we have OAuth2 or we have WSSE. But for both of them, I will just need to generate my key, which I haven't done yet. Trainings, admin. I go to my user. And here I can generate the key. So without it, I would not be able to use WSSE, or I can create OAuth application if I want to use OAuth authorization. Here in the sandbox, it would work without both of them because I can authenticate myself using session. But I just wanted to show you whenever I create the key, I have WSSE right now authentication. And there are two types of API. The new one is JSON API, and the old is deprecated but still used because we have client using it. And actually, as I remember, the search is still there. Let me find the search. Okay, we have the search. So there are two types, search and the search advanced. First of all, this is the clickable. So I have some documentation about it. In the new API is much more robust. I will show you this in a moment, but also we'll cover this in the API topic. And I have the sandbox. So there is an example. I can search for Debra from Oral Contact. So here I have the search, Debra from Oral Contact, and this is where you use Alias. It will be not user-friendly to specify fully qualified class name here, right? So this is why you have aliases for the entities, and they are used for the search. And also, if you want to, relate to the entity without having to specify the fully qualified class names, which also have slashes, which is not very friendly for your URL, for example. And I have the results. So I have entity name, the record ID, and the string. So also the URL I can lead to this. Okay, so for example here, this is the one I will found on the UI. So the one from the contact, which is Mrs. Deborah Allen from the contact entity. Also, I can use advanced search. And this here, I have the description of the syntax. So how can I use it? And let's just copy the value from here. So this looks a little bit like SQL, right? So I have select first name from oral contact, where the first name is like Deborah. And this is query. And I have the records count 1, and I have the record returned here with the link to the entity. Okay. And now, how do you reindex? So first of all, the listeners, whenever you edit the entity, there will be message add to reindex this entity. And then when you process your message queue, it will be reindexed. But there also is a comment. So actually, let's execute it. Oh, I haven't switched my PHP. And now it's done synchronously. You don't want to execute it this way in production with the big database because it will take a long time. Here, it took just a moment, and my entities would be reindexed. Also, I will show you the message queue. It's empty, okay? And if I would like to reindex with the schedule, I would just go scheduled. And now reindex task should be done here. I have the information to oral search reindex, and it will be executed when I consume my queue. Okay, and now my entities will be reindexed, and I can do this in parallel with few consumers, which will be way better for you than wait for this comment to take very long time if you have big database. And also there is a search ACL helper apply, so you can apply ACLs to your search results. So even if the match is there and you don't have access to the specific entity, the result would not be displayed for you. Okay, guys, I think we can do another 10 minutes break, and then we'll finish this. It's not that much to left. Then 10 minutes question and answer session, maybe 15. It depends how many questions you will have. And I will show you the practice. Again, you can do this. It's really nice to check if you know how to work with it, or you have additional questions that we can answer on the last day. But it will be really up to you. So 10 minutes break, guys. Okay, guys, let's continue. So I see there is some question already, questions. We will answer them all together once we finish this section. It's not that much left, okay? So there are some docs for you, so you can check the architecture, and also this one is the one you may need. It's how you exactly configure this file, and all the information for every section here that you can use. Like the thing I mentioned, that you can, for example, have first name, last name, and the name prefix pointing to the same target field. So all of those will be joined in this virtual name field in the index. Excuse me, I just misclicked again. Okay, so when we talk about search, we also always want to talk about the autocomplete. It's an important part of the search. So we have few autocomplete components across the system, and they use search. So this is important to understand, and this is one thing I would like to always show. So we have customer and customer users, okay? Right now, I will stop my message queue. As you can see, it's idle all the time, by the way. This is in the very robust mode, and I have idle and still have some information what is going on when it's consuming the queue. I stopped it. So I will just create a customer right now. and I will call it demo customer. Just the label. And now when I would like to create the customer user, I need to select the customer, okay? So I would like to select my demo customer. It's not here, okay? But if I would click the hamburger button, I will see the data grid, and the demo customer is here. So what's the reason? The reason is the data grid uses the ORM as a data source, so those are the results from the database, while the dropdown here is using autocomplete, which is searching the index. So if I would now process the message queue, okay, it should refresh the index, and my demo customer is already here. Okay, so whenever you see this component, it's good to remember that the dropdown, the autocomplete is using the search index, while the hamburger is using the ORM. So those are different data sources. And if you do not have consumers running, you may have different results here. Or for example, if you migrated database and you didn't run the search indexation. And how can you configure the autocomplete? Actually, this is very simple. First of all, we have the form types that uses the autocomplete. And all you have to do is to set the autocomplete alias, okay? So we have the contact select type. As you can see, as parent, we have this one is oral entity select or create inline. It's also called create because as you saw, excuse me, too many tabs. Here I also have the plus button, so I can create customer on the fly. So this is the customer form. I can create it here, click save, and it will be created and then persisted when I store the form. Okay, so this is why it's called select or create inline, and it is using the autocomplete functionality. So here, first of all, I have the autocomplete alias. I also have, excuse me, I also have create form route, which is pointing which route should be used when I click the create button, and some additional configs like for the template of the autocomplete, so this one. As you can see, this is a very plain template. I can have it a little bit more sophisticated if I need. So this is how you can use it. And if you would like to create new autocomplete handler, it's also a very simple thing. So let's actually open this in IDE. There it is. So I created a new service. I point to the parent, which is form autocomplete full name search handler. So I just extend some existing service. And then I just pass some arguments. First of all, what entity I'm going to be searching for, so contact, and what field should be searched. Okay, so I created this way. As you can see, it's very simple. I created the autocomplete handler for the contact entity that will be searching in those fields. And then I have to tag it, or form autocomplete search handler. I can apply ACL resource, so which resource should be checked for displaying the results. And the very important one is to add the alias. So this alias is what I used in the form. So, excuse me. So here, this is the alias. Okay, so that's it. I have the component ready. I can create a component that extends the basic one and just specify which alias this component should use. Of course, you can have more complex cases, then you can create your own search handler. But the very simple one, and in most cases sufficient one, it's like this. Now we have the name providers. I will not make this full screen anymore because as you can see, I switch a lot between the tabs right now. So we already seen the name providers working. So whenever we decorated one yesterday. So name provider is used to show us the text representation of entity object. Okay, so usually we would have underscore toString method for this. In Oro, we have those name providers which give us a little bit more flexibility, and they should have two methods. First one will return the text representation. The other one will return part of the DQL that will allow us to get this text representation from database. So I can also use the name provider and fetch this name from the database using DQL. We use them all over the system, so everywhere when we'd like to. Also, for example, here on the page header, it's used by the Twig extension, right? Actually, sorry, let's go to the users. Users. And this is it. So this use the Twig extension. Twig extension use the entity name provider registry, find the one that is handling the user that we actually overwrote yesterday, decorated yesterday, and displayed the proper text. So for contact, it works similar way as we have yesterday. So here we can see get name. We check if entity is of type class. If yes, we get the name displayed, otherwise we can return false, for example. If we had the decorator, we also checked for the instance and displayed the correct name, and otherwise we just fall back to the original name provider. We're gonna extend our name provider decorator on the next practice session. So the demo you already seen. So this is for the contact and contact name entity, contact name provider you've seen, but let's see this Oro format name again. Oro format name, and I would like to have it in contact bundle. Almost like this. Okay, so this is the Twig extension. As you can see, I have the entity name resolver. And this have the registry of all the, where is it? All the name providers. So when it's get name called, it will just display the name, but we have it decorated. So in our case, we will first display the one we created. And it is in the here, entity name provider decorator. Here we can check some condition. This is already modified from yesterday for the today's practice, and display the specific representation of this entity. Otherwise, we use the original one, and the original one actually goes through the all text fields for this entity, and depending on the format that you can also specify, it will display all of the text fields or only the few ones. So actually there is some logic if you do not create your own entity name provider. Then we have those entity aliases. As you saw, we have them, for example, for search, but this is not the only place when you can use them. And we also use them for API, for example, and they can be different for the same entity for the search and the API. It's not common use case, but if you need it, you can do it. And so this is like the elegant way to refer to entity, because fully qualified class name is something we really get used to it, but it's not very convenient to specify it every time we'd like to narrow down the search to the contact, right? It is much better to type Oro contact. So this is why we use them. And there is a registry created, so for each alias you can get the class name, and reverse, for each class name you can get the alias. So this is pretty convenient. So you can specify them in the YAML file, and here you have the information how it will be generated if you do not specify it by yourself. So it depends if this is Oro or third-party bundle. It will get the part of the bundle from the namespace and create the alias for you by yourself. So this happens only if you do not specify it by yourself. You're also gonna play with this on the API topic practice. And if I would like to specify it, I can create entity YAM in my configurable directory. And here I have the entity aliases. I specify the class and always specify singular and plural version of the alias. Okay, so this is simple. And thanks to this, I don't need to use those names in the APIs or in the search, for example. And the last thing, and I found it really useful a few times already, it's called virtual fields and the relations. So we have the reporting system, and this reporting system allows user to build custom reports. So I can have managed custom reports. And usually this is done by the marketing, so the users that are not developers, they are not aware about the relations between the entities, some specific condition, and so on. I can create a report, and let's say I would like to have the lead report. And for the leads, or for the contacts, I have the email, but this is not the singular email. This is a list of emails. So let me show you the lead. Whenever I create lead, there is an emails, and this is a collection, as you can see, and one is marked as the primary or the default. And now I would like to create a report that will only list this primary email. So I would start by choosing the entity. Of course, I will add some name, leads, emails. Here I can select the columns, and those are the properties of this lead. And if I would like to do this myself, I would probably get the emails and email value. And then I would create field condition and say that email primary must be true. Okay, so I will need to know a little bit about the database. And also this is very simple condition. What I also can do, I can create the virtual field or virtual relation. And thanks to this, my marketing will be able to type primary email and will be able to pick it as it would be a property. It is not property. I do not have this field in my entity, but still I can use it in reports. And how it works. I can go to the sales bundle, which is the place where I have leads. And then I have the resources, config, oro, entity YAML. And here I have the virtual fields. So I don't need one for the B2B customer, I need one for the leads. Okay, and I configure primary email, and I configure what query is under this field. So actually I select the email from the joint entity called entity emails with the condition that primary is true. Okay, so now I expose this field. It can be used in the reports, and the marketing doesn't have to know the logic of my database. It's a pretty good thing. And also I can do the same for the virtual relations. For example, if there is no relation between those two entities, but they can be related using some additional joins, I can create relation. For example, from lead, I can join the account using some additional queries. Or for example, I can display primary address. I have the many-to-many addresses, so lead can have many addresses. One is primary. So thanks to this, I have the primary address, and it will be in my report under this label, so primary address. Let's check. Primary address, I do not have it in fields, I have it in the related entities, so because I created the virtual relations. And then I can pick which field of this related entity I would like to add to the report. Okay, so really convenient way, and we use this in many projects. Our client asked us, hey, I would need this report, it sounds pretty complex. You can add some virtual fields. Also, if the query for this report is very difficult, you can create custom reports in the code. So there will be not here, that will be displayed above, and those are reports created by the Datagrid YAML. So you can create any report you want, also using Datagrid, and just display them in this section. Okay, guys, some best practices. First of all, and this is best practices from the yesterday and today's topic. If you can use standard doctrine field relation entity, do it. So if this is the entity you just created, you don't have to use or a custom field or custom relations. You have control over it. You can go to the entity class, add some annotations, add some properties, and it will be faster than creating them virtually in database and then generating the cache. So it's just better for your performance. If you need bidirectional relation to our entity, you have to use extended relation because there must be also property added to the ORO entity, okay? And if you need to work sometimes with entity really fast, for example, doing the initial import, you can skip using ORM and just build plain SQLs. Please just remember that you need to sanitize your, not sanitize, but to escape your data and validate it because you will not have the validation out of the box. And please remember about the doctrine hydration. So if you have a lot of objects and you would like to try to display or fetch the information, it will be hydrated and it takes time. You can modify, and this is the one we also use quite common, you can modify doctrine annotation using this load class metadata event, for example, to override the custom repository that is already defined in the entity class you do not have control over. You might disable some events listeners completely using this optional listener interface. Also, it is useful for importing data, the initial data, and when you do not want to, for example, track changes in data audit. We do not use repository as a service. So you always fetch the repository or entity manager from the manager registry. If you would like to add or modify existing section of Datagrid, the simpler and the fastest way to create Datagrid YAML in your bundle and just merge the configuration. It will not work for more complex situations, more complex cases, and it will not work if you want to remove some section. In this case, you should use the events. So there are 2 events for the build of configuration and 2 events for the results. As ORO is a big system and it can be used in many time zones in many different currencies, remember that whenever you would like to display the values, they should be localized. So you should take care of this. The values that are already in ORO are localized, so they depend on the date times and the localities. Okay, guys, now let's do the question answers. I can see there is not that many of them, so please, if you have any question, just don't hesitate and ask. I will answer all of them, and then I will show you the practice. And this practice solution you will see on the next webinar, Tuesday next week, before the theory. So, Adrianka, is it possible to change template to a grid? No, you can change template to a specific field, or otherwise you will need to do some customization. It's not like out of the box solution to change the template to it. But for example, front-end product grid, it is also a data grid. And as you can see, it's very different for all other data grids. Gautam, is it possible to group landing pages contents of blocks in folders? I'm not sure I understand. If you could please explain what do you mean, or just post this to the Slack and we can continue there. Max Perey, sorry, but where are we? We are supposed to declare get naming type method in user naming bundle. You are not supposed to do this. So when you create a migration, you see here you specify the association name, and it means that in the user entity in cache, excuse me. Customer. yeah, you have the naming type, and there will also be get naming type method. So once your migration are executed, there will be fields added to your table in database, and also the methods for it generated in cache. And also I see you ask about it in the chat. I'm having trouble with naming type, entity get naming type in the entity name provider decorator. So in this decorator, you need to be sure about one thing. You will not ask about get naming type before you check the type of the entity. So let's open it. So if I would not have this condition, my decorator will be executed for all the entities, and I will try to get naming type from different entities, because as you remember, I use this name provider to display also the text representation of other entities, not just the users. So then it will throw the error for any other entity because they do not have this relation configured. So I have to be sure that I call it only for the users. And in this case, it should work for you. Sebastian, can we override field validation for all entities in validation YAM, or we have to do it in other way? So validation YAM, you can merge again. So this is good, but because it's just a merging, you cannot remove existing validation. So if you have validation, there's more strict than the existing one. For example, in Oro, there will be field length 100 characters, and you want to apply 50, it's okay. It will merge, and because your one is more strict, it will be applied. If you want to change it to 150, it will be not that easy. So you can read how to customize validation in Symfony, and for this we use validation groups. So you have to create a new validation group and then validate your entity against the group, not against the default one. Also, if this is custom constraint, you could override the constraint class or the validator class. Roberto, is there a way to disable the search functionality to stop indexation if we don't need the feature? Roberto, please go to the Slack channel. Actually, we had this question a few days ago, and I think Andre already answered this. So please ping him in this channel, and I think he will give you the link to the answer. And Kelly, if you want to remove a menu item that has been configured in the code and cannot be deleted in admin, what was the best way to do it? And so you can create a listener to remove it, or you could hide it. And hide you can do even with the UI. Gautam, like under landing pages, can we create folders? Example, marketing system to group the landing pages. Oh, okay, understand. I don't think we have this functionality. I would have to check with the team that was responsible for this if there are any plans to do this, but I don't think so. Okay, guys, I think that's it. There is no more question, and the chat is also answered. So let me show you the practice. I just need to find it. Just a second. Okay. So this is the same practice, but you started yesterday by the migration in fixtures. And right now, we should fix the name provided decorator, okay? So right now, we have the relation from user to user naming type. So for the user, we can specify the naming type being used. Let me just show it to you in the form. So right now I can go to the users. I can edit the first one. And here I will be able to specify which naming type I should use. Okay, for example, official. So as you remember, yesterday we decorated the name provider and we hard-coded the first name, middle name, and last name, as you remember. So right now we should not hard-code it. We should use the one that is selected for the specific user. So we loaded few types with the entities. So if I select the official, only those parts of the name should be rendered. If I select unofficial, use those parts. If I select first name only, use only the first name. Okay, so I should modify the decorator, check what is the naming type of this specific user, and display the correct text representation. If there is no naming type specified for this user, use the default behavior. Then we should create a simple CRUD for those naming types. By simple, I said we will not have any forms to modify it. We only have the index page. So I should add the controller, I should add the template, I should create the data grid and add it to the navigation to be displayed, for example, here. And whenever I click it, I should see the index page for those naming types with the data grids with the view, and this delete should be added automatically if you add proper configuration to your entity. So menu was added. Then we should add the simple view page. So add the raw action so I can click it. And after I click it, just display the simple information first. So this, the title, the naming format, and how it would look like the name formatted with this naming format. So just the example. Then, if you would like to practice more, you can create a tweak extension to render this example. So not hard-coded, just to have the tweak extension do this for me using the specified naming format. And then make it searchable. So I should create the search yam in resources config oro, specify which field should be searchable, which should be indexed, create the template for the search results, consume the messages from the queue and check if it works. Also, I skipped one part, excuse me. Oh yeah, on the view page, I could add the grid of the user who used this naming format. So I have the view page of this naming type. And if there are any users that already have this naming type assigned, I should display the data grid here. So this I can practice how I can include additional data grids in the template and also how to add some params, because right now I only want to display specific users that have this exact naming type selected. Okay, so if you have any questions about this practice, you can ask them right now. I'm not sure if you're gonna do this. I will show you the solution and we're gonna discuss it on Tuesday. And this is really, the entities and the data is one of the most important topic because you're gonna use it every time you're gonna customize or you will modify something about the entities. You will for sure create data grids or modify the search. Okay? And so that's it from my side today. And we are not having any webinar tomorrow, so have a good Friday and great weekend, and talk to you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.